problem with attributing any intrinsic qualities to such things as electrons, protons, and other particles. Look, these particles form a different way and in different circumstances without any impact. In one case, they form it acts like a particle. In other circumstances, it acts like an electromagnetic wave. So, doesn't it make problems for your interpretation that it has one stable quality?
I'd like to hear more about why exactly wave-particle duality would be inconsistent. But actually, just to be clear, the talk I've just given now was not a talk supporting panpsychism. It was a talk supporting an approach, right? An approach that takes introspective data about the nature of consciousness and from the physical sciences equally. And some people, and Sam Coleman, he finds panpsychism absurd, and he takes us in another direction. So it's not that this entails panpsychism. We don't even to certain forms of dualism or idealism. I just find panpsychism looks to be the most, on the face of it, the most sort of straightforward and parsimonious way of explaining it. And lots of people think, there could be arguments of what is involved in conscious experience. Some people think it's essentially representational in a very sophisticated way, that it's absurd to attribute it to a fundamental particle. I'm inclined to just think there is some very general, determinable category captured by the Nagel expression, what it's like, that there's something that it's like to be. So there's no conceptual bar to attributing consciousness to an electron. So why would the fact that it's wave-particle duality be
the particle, the supposed electron changes its properties without any input. So it doesn't experience any input from other particles or from, I don't know, forces, whatever. It just changes properties when we change the point of view.
So maybe it changes consciousness. I don't know. Why would that be a problem for attributing consciousness to it?
That was my question to you.
Yeah. No, it's very interesting. I've actually never thought about that. I'll have to think about that. For start, how to understand quantum mechanics is extremely controversial. And for a start, the many worlds interpretation we don't have collapses the wave function and so on. I'll think about that. That's a very interesting point.
Yeah, just to clarify your point, as I understand, physics looks at electrons as fundamentally the same, entities. So, do you think that each electron has a different intrinsic nature, or they also have the same intrinsic nature?
I'd be inclined to.
And how do you tell? Like maybe it's the same electron. So there's one electron with one intrinsic nature with superposition. I don't. How do you like?
Well, we do the work and we look to the thing. I'd be inclined to look to physics in the first instance, and it, as you said, seems from the physics perspective that they do seem to have the same nature in the sense that they behave in the same way. As far as I know, I'm not a physicist. There might be, but we've got another thing to account for, right? The evident reality of consciousness, and we need to incorporate the two. Maybe it might be reason to postulate distinct intrinsic entries to natures to electrons. I don't know. That would just come out in the theory. I don't have a worked out theory of. There is a great paper called "What's It Like to Be a Quark" by my fellow panpsychist Pat Lutus. But yeah, look, this would panpsych. So this, I guess,
it's really interesting. I guess I'm following with Keith's line somehow. How would you tell what would be the intrinsic nature of the electron? I understand that your evidence, your evidence is consciousness, and but how. Tom Nagel probably couldn't write a paper saying what it's like to be an electron, but and then was been experimenting with questions how to be a thermostat, but from a different perspective. But how would you what is the research program?
Right, what is the research program? One of my favorite examples. why Einstein's special relativity, theory of special relativity, relative to the Lorentzian theory which preceded it, as far as I'm aware, to correction here, they are empirically equivalent, right? They both account for the datum that the speed of light is observed to be the same in all frames of reference. The difference is Einstein had a much simpler, elegant interpretation of that datum, and that's why the scientific community universally went for Einstein's theory. And in fact, what was driving Einstein's special relativity, again, as I understand it, open to be corrected, I mean, he wasn't, with special relativity, he wasn't out going experiments. What he wanted to do was bring greater unity to physics, right? He saw that there was a principle of relativity in older science of mechanics, and there was no principle of relativity in the new science of electromagnetism. So he thought, that's not very pretty. We need a principle of relativity in both. So, I mean, so one fundamental way we do science, Jesse talked a lot about, we need to fit the data. That's one aspect of science, right? We fit data. But so, at least, certainly in the more theoretical ends of science, we look for theoretical elegance, virtue, fittingness. So the methodology is, look, we take these two sources of data and we try to formulate our best theory that accounts for both forms of data, the most elegant theory that accounts for both forms of data. I mean, I'm not there yet. I don't have a worked out theory. And look, and one more thing. I mean, I'm open to some humility here. I think, and again, it's being caught in this physicalist way of thinking about things. I think we've been so impressed by the success of the physical sciences that we think, overconfident about what we can achieve. That we're going to, there's no reason to think we can't get all of it. And, I mean, the Church's book, it's you naysayers if you're pessimistic. But I think that's only because we stopped trying to tell us what matter was and we just focused on causal structure. That's why it became easier, in a sense, although it's still incredibly hard. So I'm open to the idea that we might never be able to get all the details, right? Maybe we'll just be able to know that panpsychism in some general form is the most reasonable speculation. Maybe we won't be able to fill in the details. Maybe, I'm not like McGinn that I definitely know we can't, and I'm going to give it my best go. But, some people like Sam Coleman I mentioned earlier, think we're really going to get there and we're really going to get a positive theory. And, I'm up for going about that in the way I've just explained. But I'm open to the possibility that naturally evolved creatures are not able to get at all the details of how the world is. Why should that be the case? In a way, given that we're the products of natural selection, it's more likely to think we're not going to get the details. But
just make something clear to me, just sort of logically. I had never thought of the manifestation of a disposition as another disposition. The sugar sitting in the box is not melting. So it's on the face of it, we've got things with dispositions and manifestations of dispositions. We've also got spatial location. I'm also not clear about the intrinsic-extrinsic distinction. What's wrong with a picture of a thing that in and of itself just does all these different things in certain circumstances? There's the dispositions, the manifestations, and maybe that's all there is. I mean, maybe the things can be identified in terms of their spatial location. What's wrong with this picture? Okay, I mean, you just assume the manifestations are dispositions. That just seems, on the face of it, flatly false. Okay, so I mean, I have, for sake of time, massively oversimplified things. You're right, there's a different distinction between extrinsic and intrinsic and dispositional and categorical, and Dirk's notion of absolutely intrinsic properties, and spatiotemporal properties. But as to the more specific point you made about why equate the manifestation of a disposition with another disposition, well, I mean, I'm considering the position where every property is a disposition. But so why on earth believe that? I mean, I'm not a philosopher of science, but having studied physics at high school and college, and so I never in my life would have thought that physics is just describing dispositions. There's also things moving through space and so forth.
Right. Okay. So you're talking about spatiotemporal properties. Okay. So
not just spatial.
What's
changes in mass, changes in energy,
well,
changes in.
I think
change itself a disposition? It may be manifesting a disposition, but it isn't itself a disposition. Or at least we need an argument that it is.
If you're talking about things like mass and energy, I think when you reflect, to a certain extent they can feel.
No, the change in the mass, not the mass. Change in mass, change in energy, change in temperature, change in position.
But I mean, what is changes
the event, not the.
Yeah, but changes. an event is that involves change is moving from one property to another property. Tell me the property that comes about that's not dispositional.
It's not the dispositional.
Andy.
So I guess I've got a conceptual problem here. You can just move me along in it. So if you go looking for something like a Higgs boson, you go looking for something that is defined by its behavior. It seems to me that what science does, what thought does, is it creates models of the world. Those models are populated by entities, but those entities seem to be constantly defined by what they do. Yeah. So I don't actually know how to go about looking for the nature of something, apart from seeing whether there's a pattern like that in what's being done, the pattern that seems to define the entity. I just don't see what else to do. How can you, don't you just get left with the pure mental stuff in some way? If you take your route, you can never get at the intrinsic nature of matter. Maybe you can get the intrinsic nature of the mental because you kind of got it already or something, but that still doesn't help us do much.
I mean, one thing I could say is quote Patricia Churchill's books that, you know, here's a fallacious argument. We can't imagine how we're going to do it, so, you know, it's going to be impossible. I mean, it seems to be like, that in one way I can hear it like that, you know. I mean, but I mean, I can, well, look.
But there's no reason to embark on the research program where we've no idea how you can do it.
But there is a reason to, because, you know, to avoid swallowing those two bitter pills, right?
I actually have a follow-up. I have a similar question to Andy's. Here's one way of putting it. So maybe the thought that here's a thought. We do in fact have a grasp of straightforwardly physical, non-dispositional categorical properties. It's just an illusion of a certain sort that we don't. So, and the reason is that there's only two ways for us to specify to explicate knowledge of straightforwardly physical properties. One is dispositionally, and the other is in terms of constitution into more fundamental properties. There's really two ways. Now, if they're fundamental properties, you're not going to be able to do B, right? That's not possible. And so all that's really left is dispositional characterization. That's not going to satisfy you. Okay, so take Locke for example. Locke says, look, you know, the fundamental categorical nature of matter is what he calls solidity, which is the categorical basis of absolute impenetrability. Yeah. Okay, and you say, well, what's it like? Well, the thing is, there are only two things you can do, right? Analyze it into more fundamental properties, and that's by definition impossible, or do the dispositional thing, which isn't going to satisfy you. Yeah. Okay, but so what's your argument that Locke is wrong with it? We don't have some sort of grasp of categorical solidity.
What meaning? You mean the Lockean notion of fundamental solidity?
That's right. Yeah, which is categorical based.
Okay, I mean.
Impenetrability.
Yeah, I mean that's not a hypothesis that. I mean, I would entirely want to dismiss from someone working with this kind of methodology. I mean,
he says, look, we do have these immediate grasp, perhaps, of, at least in your view, of mental categorical properties. And so you're really just prejudicing the whole inquiry in favor of categorical mental properties by not admitting the Lockean possibility.
I've given, I mean, I mentioned panpsychism once. I mean, I've given a very, very general framework, taking you know, the essence of the framework is we've got two sources of data here. We've got two things we know are real, consciousness and dispositional structure. And, you know, we have to somehow work out the best way of putting them together. That's the starting point. And, you know, panpsychism is one, looks are very straightforward and on the face. But, I mean, other options, I mean, I take an option that did involve some kind of primitive notion of Lockean solidity. If that was involved in some such theory, I don't think that would be, maybe it would be slightly against the letter of what I've just said, but I think that could be in the same spirit. I mean, the kind of views you talk about in your book. I mean, personally myself, I'm inclined to be an illusionist about Lockean solidity, like Hume thinks we have, you know, I just think we've got a notion of solidity, but there's really nothing there. But I don't have any arguments. But the main point is, yeah, I mean, I think an approach that involved that might very well fit with the kind of framework I'm talking about.
Nick?
First, sort of a wonderful demonstration of the motivational power of consciousness. I love seeing your passion there. And, you know, Andy was saying, whatever reason it is to think that one of the roles of consciousness is to motivate people to act in new ways. But what I really wanted to come back to was just to remind you of two quotations from your hero, Bertrand Russell. I'm not going to get them exactly right, but in one he said, I wish to commend to the reader a doctrine so radical that I expect it will never be accepted, and it's that we should not believe in a theory for which there is absolutely no evidence to believe that it's true. That's one. The other one is he said that the habit of postulating fundamental properties in order to explain what we want to explain has many advantages. They are the advantages of theft over honest toil. I wonder what Russell would have actually made of your talk.
I think Russell in 1927 at least would have completely agreed. Read Analysis of Matter and it's evident. And it's incredible to me that people have forgotten this about Russell. But I mean, just to reasons...
Charity.
What we have, talking about reason to believe, look, everybody has their starting points. You know, if you think I'm not going to go beyond experience, you're not going to get further than solipsism. You're not going to be able to trust your memory. Everybody has certain starting points, you know, and this is where a certain sort of physicsalism often assumes that, you know, they're not making any starting points, they're just going to science. But, you know, to start science, you need to assume there's an external world, you need to assume there are other minds, perhaps you need to assume the future will resemble the past, right? What seems to me a very good starting point is, I'm conscious. Like, I'm in agony that there is a certain way that feels. I mean, that seems to me a very good starting point for thinking. In fact, you know, it's more evident. I think Descartes was right that those kind of things are more evident than the external world even. So, yeah, I mean, I don't see why you feel a certain pressure that we've got to overcome those intuitions. That you might be right. That I might be under an illusion, but you know, I might be in the matrix. And I think it's an ideology basically, because we've become so impressed with technology and, you know, that we've thought, oh, we've got to, you know, basically deny consciousness. And I think in 100 years' time, we'll look back and think, that was a really odd period of history, where all these people were on a boat arguing there was no consciousness. Yeah, I really do.
So, Philip, first of all, I want to agree with Andy. These pills aren't bitter at all. They're quite tasty. I mean, really.
Well, listen,
really, they're tasty, and they're tasty for a very good reason. Is that they are part of a research program which is multifarious, multi-stranded, with all sorts of things in the offing, and we know how to go about doing it. And the trouble with your postulation of intrinsic properties is that, as a number of people have suggested, an intrinsic property seems to be systematically elusive. Nothing could be evidence for it, because whatever evidence you find is just going to be another manifestation of another disposition. And if intrinsic properties are not discovered by what they do, then they're not discoverable at all. So you end up postulating an intrinsic property to conscious states, an intrinsic property to matter, and talk about theft versus honest toil. The research program is over. There is nothing more to ask. There's no questions to ask. There's nothing could count as an answer, because an evidence would have to be evidence of another dispositional property.
Okay, I want to say two things. Firstly, whenever I talk about consciousness to Wittgensteinians, they always say, but you're left with skepticism about other minds. As though a theory that ends up with having that problem, it must be wrong. I just think, well, I do. That's a shame. I think that's the human epistemic situation, that we you know, have this epistemic difficulty knowing whether that's just the human situation. I'm not. Now it seems I hear what you're saying. You're saying like physical science is great, right? So it should be able to count for everything. I mean, maybe the world's not perfect. Maybe it would be great if we could get at the intrinsic nature of matter with the sort of precision and interpersonal testing. I was having this argument with Keith on the first day. It would be great if we could, but if we can't, that's the human situation. I don't think we should rule out a view because. I mean, it's almost like you're saying it's a view I'd like to believe. It's a view I'd like to. You're saying to me, you know, it sounds like you're saying the view would like to believe.
All the stuff we can do looks just the same, though.
But I'm not.
Nothing changed in the realm of what we can do.
Your alternative program has no first or second step to it. There's nowhere to
2 points. Let me repeat how the methodological program. I mean, there is lots we can do. We can do neuroscience, we can do psychophysics, we can correlate conscious states with brain states, we can try and analyze conscious states in more fundamental terms. We can, there's a great PhD student in Toronto trying to make sense of conscious states being made up of kind of simpler experiences. We can look for commonalities between neural structures and yeah, we can do all this trying to make sense of the intrinsic nature of simpler forms of matter in terms of what we know about from consciousness in our own case. So I think there is a rich methodological way forward here. Now, but the second point, I suspect it won't be as good as natural science. It won't work as well because for the reason, interpersonal testing is that these properties are quite elusive. I don't think, maybe we might get to a point where there are certain hypotheses left that we can't rule out, and we just have to say this is the best guess we can have. I suspect it'll be like that. But again, I think there is a way forward, and we should try it. If it ends up not getting as far as we'd like, then I just say, shit, that's the way things are. That's what we're naturally evolved creatures. Why should we expect that we're going to be able to get all the details of how the universe works?
How can you tell if a particular step you take in your research program is wrong?
How did we know that special relativity is better than Lorentz's view?
Well, we had a more powerful and simpler theory.
Exactly, so it'd be like that.
Well, but can you
That's it.
fill that out with any?
It is.
Yeah,
Well,
what we would like to hear
it's going to be
is some gap of ignorance that's closed by taking this other method. Something that's been that we physicalists have been scratching our heads about and despairing that we don't have the theory, and you folks come along and say, but look, we can predict this.
If you're asking for the kind of data, a better explanation of the kind of data you want explained, then I don't think that's going to happen precisely because you're just dealing with one set of data, and we're trying to deal with which. Look, as I agree with Dave that the neuroscience is philosophically neutral. So it's we're engaged with the same project as doing the neuroscience, but we're also trying to do something else. We're also trying to speculate to some degree at the best way of colouring in that causal structure that we're both interested in uncovering. We're both interested in. Think of it like this. We're all on a project together of getting the black and white causal structure. But people like me are on another project of trying to speculate, how it's probably coloured in, and and the way it's going to be something like metaphysics. It's going to involve empirical science, but it's also going to be something like metaphysics. Trying to argue about what theories are more or less arbitrary, what theories are more simple or coherent. I have arguments about. Some people think it makes sense for qualities to be qualia to exist unexperienced. There's one debate about coherence there. But I'd say, come back to the example of special relativity again. I think there's no empirical thing there. It was a move in terms of elegance, and so some moves are going to be like that.
I'm not sure you're directly addressing. I thought Dan's fundamental point was all of the data are dispositions. Yeah, and so you've got to say something. You've got to say something about that. I think.
Yeah, but that's not all the data. Right, that's not all the data.
Well, so give us an example of a datum that isn't just dispositions.
Consciousness, that's the point. That's the other datum.
How do you know the information you have about consciousness is I mean, how do you know that what you're disposed to say about it? You have to sort of do a bit of introspecting. You have to pay attention to it. And I always ask me what's my knowledge. I have to report it. I have to sort of think about it and say, well, it's like this, it's kind of like this. How do I know that's accurate? I mean, we seem to be giving you the first person data for free. Well, I don't think we have the first person data for free.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So that was the question. How do we get?
How do I know it's getting at the relevant, a collection of bits in my very intrinsic nature of the relevant bits? Maybe it's getting at a tiny bit. It's getting big. I don't know.
I would do it the same way you do it. I would. Obviously, listen. I mean, there is no doubt that we get our conscious experience wrong in certain respects, and there are lots of interesting empirical findings that we get out right. I don't think it follows from that we get conscious experience wrong in all respects. So I would explore consciousness in exactly the same way. I would do psychophysics. I would look at the brain. But the only difference is, I think whatever we find out about I mean, I think the very general determinable of consciousness is qualitative, and so no matter how wrong we are about consciousness, unless we're eliminativist about it, there's going to be another datum here.
Do you think there's any access that I have to my intrinsic qualities that is not mediated by some sort of causal process?
Yes.
You do.
Yes, I believe in acquaintance.
And what are the two terms? Like one is the qualitative nature. Who's the subject that's having access to it? On the other hand,
I think subjects are involved in a very special relationship with the where's Martina? Experiential properties called acquaintance, which is, yeah, I mean, I think consciousness involves an intrinsic kind of self-representation.
And with an causally unmediated relation.
Yeah. No, look,
Sorry,
I haven't argued for that, I've just stated that, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think you need to say that, yes. And I think it's important you say that to make it very clear.
So why is that vital to the project, though? I mean,
it looks like you're going to something heavily dualistic about subjects to me.
It doesn't look very naturalistic.
It gives you a project which you can seem to have, but what does it do with that?
hold on. What do you mean by naturalistic?
Well,
That is a word.
a direct personal access to an intrinsic property seems like a rabbit pulled out of a hat. It just doesn't seem to bear any relationship to any other kind of evidence we have. Now, if you insist on it and you just say, well, there's all the other evidence we have, and then we have direct, unmediated, and perhaps incorrigible access to intrinsic properties of our experience, I mean, that's a fairly big mouthful. I don't think do you really want to go that route?
I'm not sure what the essential difficulty. I mean, it's beyond a rhetorical point, or I mean, but look, that's not the starting point, right? The starting point, the motivation is the standard anti-physicalist arguments, right?
It's a starting point because it didn't go to first-person data. You can't just help yourself to that without taking on the commitments.
The starting point is the anti-physicalist arguments, which, well, just let me say, the anti-physicalist arguments which lead us to the conclusion, I think, that consciousness cannot be accounted for in purely causal terms. So then we can either be eliminativists, and you agree with those arguments, right? Or but there's a further question here: how do we make sense of our relationship to phenomenal qualities? And that needs spelling out. I happen to favour an acquaintance model that I've argued for at great length, and I haven't said that here. Other people don't, right? Sam Coleman, I've mentioned the third time now, just thinks the notion of acquaintance is ridiculous for the reasons you've said. There has to be... So that's not an essential part of this starting point. So I think maybe these two things, the very general starting point, which is sort of refusing to swallow those two bitter pills and saying, I feel no pressure to swallow those two bitter pills.
I don't think that's your... I'm not sure that's your starting point. I mean, isn't your starting point that there are third-person data, which might be roughly the causal dispositional stuff.
Yeah.
But also there are introspective data, which are not the causal dispositional stuff.
Right.
I mean, and someone like Keith or Dan could put forward the radical view that, well, in fact, we ought to reconstruct those first-person data as something dispositional. But I think, even someone like Keith or Dan will say, well, that's actually a radical and counterintuitive view that comes with a lot of cost. So that's where your starting point was. We don't have to pay that cost. So we don't need to make that move. And that seems to be before all the anti-physicalist arguments. I mean, there are these introspective data, which are not dispositional data.
I would say the starting point is that we are aware of consciousness and it can't be accounted for in purely causal terms. That would be the starting point.
We're starting points. Our starting points to give up the bowl in the light of theorizing.
Second?
Our starting points give up the bowl or revisable in the light of theorizing, or starting points like fixed for you. Like when you start with this thing, you theorize for a while, because you at that point say, oh, my starting point is a bad one, I'm going to give it up. Is that possible for you?
Interesting question. I mean, the methodology I've set up has these two data to be respected. Now, here's an interesting question. Could there be could one of the data look like it eliminates the other?
Right.
I guess in some way, maybe this is where I disagree with Martina. I guess I'm kind of open to that. If there was an incredible empirical argument that consciousness was an illusion.
Actually, a credible empirical.
Sorry. I meant incredible in the
We have
sense
some
that
incredible ones.
if there was a marvelous empirical argument, I might be prepared to be an illusionist about consciousness. If there was, and vice versa, maybe I'd be prepared to be an idealist. If there was a very, I'd be much more open to idealism, to be honest. But you know, so there are, I just, you know, from the physicalist perspective, it's almost like there is some pressure in respecting the history of science to think, you know, we have to get rid of these intrinsic properties. They're weird as down to their rabbits out of hats. They're naturally. I think that's an ideological viewpoint that comes out of a mischaracterization of why science is successful. Yeah. So
I can't help pointing out that I can't remember who you were quoting. The person who said that it's like you have a check, which is who was it?
Heil.
It seems as if he's falling off his own cliff there, because is he calling for a return to the gold standard and intrinsic economic value? We know that dispositions is all there is to money and checks and so forth. So it's a very good example of how you get rid of how, as we mature as a science, we get rid of the idea of an intrinsic property. We say the idea of intrinsic value is just magic. It's nonsense. We don't need a notion of intrinsic value. We thought we did. We don't.
Okay, that's good. Well, you've just persuaded me that his metaphor is badly chosen. But look, these are just metaphors, and you know, I think we can cash out a good argument that a world where there are just dispositions is just unintelligible.
So that's a very good session.
Thank you.